Hi, everybody. If you're just tuning in, we're going to wait for just 1 minute here while folks join us on the webinar. We're also getting our streaming going on Facebook and YouTube. All right, I think we're ready to get going here. Oh, let's see. Okay, we are ready to get going here. So I'm going to get us started. Hello and welcome to this Sea Otter Awareness Week webinar with Dr. Jorge Arroyo-Esquivel, hosted by Marine Conservation Institute. My name is Sarah Hamid, and I'm the Blue Parks Director and Senior Scientist at Marine Conservation Institute, and I'm really happy to be kicking off this event today. Marine Conservation Institute is a team of scientists working to save wild ocean places. We know that we can safeguard life in the sea if we protect ecosystems. So we work to identify the places in the ocean that are particularly important for marine wildlife. We advocate for protections for those places, and we work to ensure that those protections are meaningful, that they're effective. And we work at the local level here in California, at the national level, and internationally. So if you're interested to learn more about our work, particularly with Blue Parks or our Marine Protection Atlas or our advocacy here in California, or you'd like to get engaged with us, please check us out on the web. Let's see, I think the website is here, marine-conservation.org. Please reach out to us and connect with us. We would love to hear from you. And before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to introduce Heather Barrett of Sea Otter Savvy. Sea Otter Savvy is a sponsor of the Sea Otter Awareness Week, and so we're so happy to be working with them today. Heather, take it away. Uh-oh, Heather, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Couple buttons to pick there. But thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And yes, I'm Heather Barrett. I'm a sea otter biologist and the Science Communication Director with Sea Otter Savvy, and we are one of the few that work to create Sea Otter Awareness Week. So Sea Otter Awareness Week occurs every year during the last full week of September, and it is organized in partnership with Defenders of Wildlife, Sea Otter Savvy, California State Parks, Alaka Alliance, and Monterey Bay Aquarium. And we thank all of the collaborators like MCI that join us in spreading awareness. So this year marks the 21st year, and the theme is restoring missing links. So we're recognizing that sea otters remain absent from large portions of their historical range, while also celebrating the active efforts of conservation groups to restore a continuous population of these charismatic creatures and other missing elements along the Pacific coast. We also are recognizing that sea otters have influenced the livelihoods, the culture, and the spiritual aspects of coastal communities throughout human history. Many of these communities have their own words for sea otter, including the few that appear in the inner ring of this year's logo. With this week also highlights Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program, which educates communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters, and we offer a survey for community involvement. The Southern Sea Otter Range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south to a little north of Año Nuevo State Park in the north. Sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast, and they are ecologically as well as culturally significant. And there's increasing discussion regarding possible reintroduction to historical habitats. To move forward, government agencies and sea otter research community, we need to engage communities and stakeholders to hear from your perspectives. If you are wondering what you can do today, please take the Sea Otter survey if you haven't already, and share your thoughts on possible reintroduction. Your voices matter. The links, the website, the survey, that's all going to be made available to you at the end or in the chat, and it will be posted with this video as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sarah, and I'm so excited to hear from Jorge today. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. And before we get to the main event, one last thing, I just want to go over some housekeeping. for this webinar. So for those of you who are joining the webinar on Zoom, you'll see that both the chat and the Q&A are enabled. If you have a question for our speaker, please type that into the Q&A box. We won't be able to monitor both for questions. So please put all questions into the Q&A. And feel free to add your questions to that Q&A anytime during the presentation. We will address them at the end. We've reserved some time at the end for questions. So we'll get to those at the end, but you can, pop them in there whenever you think of them. And then for those of you tuning in on Facebook or YouTube, we will have someone trying to monitor for any questions that you post there and trying to relay those back to us. So feel free to post your questions and we are going to do our best to get to them. So now we are ready to dive in. Dr. Jorge Arroyo-Esquivel is a postdoctoral fellow at the Carnegie Institute for Science. In his work, Jorge focuses on how to use ecological models to inform strategies for marine conservation. Today, Jorge is going to share insights gained from his research investigating what it might mean to introduce sea otters back into the kelp forests here in Northern California, and particularly along the Sonoma coast where our kelp forests have been so diminished. So now I'm honored and excited to hand it over to Jorge.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Heather, for being part of the webinar today. Let me get started by sharing my screen. Let's see, should be, yeah. Okay, great. Yes, so thank you everyone for coming today. I am presenting a talk that we call Reintroduction of Predators. Is this the key to a more resistant kelp forest? And I'm gonna get started talking about pretty basic concepts. Let's talk about first what the kelp forest is. And the kelp forest is one of the main ecosystems that can be found in basically all of the temperate parts of the coast in the world. And of course, our main interest here is the coast of California. And it's basically an ecosystem dominated by one or several types of these giant algae called kelp. Different species of kelp, they produce canopies, and these canopies produce different types of kelp forest. These kelp forests, they are usually highly productive ecosystems. They have a lot of biodiversity. They provide shelter for hundreds of types of species of fish, invertebrates. Some mammals like to go into the kelp forest, like the sea otters. And these forests, they coexist in the coastline with another type of ecosystem that is called the urchin barren. These urchin barrens, they are highly dominated by a single species of sea urchin. In the case of the coast of California, most of the urchin barrens that we have, they are dominated primarily by purple urchins. They are all in the ground. And there's not a lot of productivity. There's not that much kelp. Many species of fish and invertebrates, they don't go to urchin barrens because they don't have high quality food sources there. So it's an ecosystem dominated by a single species that is not as exciting for the other animal species, and it's in general thought of as a more negative ecosystem than the kelp forest. But purple urchins are also part of the ecosystem in the kelp forest, and when they are in the forest, they actually they consume kelp. But when we have all of these huge kelp plants or kelp types in the water, these kelp sometimes they drop these pieces of kelp. The plant doesn't die, but it leaves it throws some of a part of its blades or stipes into the seabed, and that's what we call drift kelp. So in a kelp forest, the urchins they can consume drift kelp. They love their drift kelp, and they don't look at the kelp, the live kelp. They can sustain themselves feeding only on drift kelp. Whereas in the urchin barren, the story is completely different. There's not that much food in the urchin barren, and that means that the little pieces of kelp that try to grow in the barren, they are almost immediately consumed by the purple urchins, and this makes uh, this makes growing kelp in an urchin barren a pretty difficult task. And this is worsened by the fact that the urchins can survive for decades, living in a state called that we usually call zombie urchins, in which they don't move that much, and if some food shows up, they will immediately go and try to eat it, so they don't starve. But they can stay in this state for more than 20 years, which makes it difficult for the kelp forest to come back from an urchin barren. So we usually think of these two systems, the kelp forest and the urchin barren, as what we call alternative stable states. Stable in the fact that they kind of reinforce themselves through these feeding mechanisms of the urchins. And it's relatively difficult to move from one state to the other. But what we've seen in the northern coast of California is that this transition has happened already. And I'm going to go to this part, the red star on the map of California is where the Sonoma and Mendocino counties are. This is the part of where our work focuses mostly on. And as you can see in the more detailed maps, the kelp coverage highly declined from a peak around the 2007-2008 years, or in the span of around 8 years. This decline was over 95% in the kelp coverage in these areas, and recovery has been a slow process. This has been caused due to a combination of several factors. In the 2014-2013 years, the sunflower seastar, which is the main predator of the purple urchins in this part of the coast, they became functionally extinct by a strange disease that we don't really understand what it is yet. It's called the wasting seastar disease. So the urchins don't have a big predator that they have to worry about in this part. That makes them more active in their grazing activity. And to make matters worse, during 2015 and 2016, we had a strong El Nino effect that people actually call it the blob, because it was like a blob of hot water that it made more difficult conditions for the kelp to grow. So there was suddenly the urchins, they don't have to worry about being eaten, and the kelp is not growing too much. This combination of factors caused the decline that we observed. And with the decline of kelp, we also start seeing declines in our populations that are of interest for the communities that live in this part of the coast. For example, one of the biggest ones is the fishing activity of recreational fisheries like the red urchin and the abalone. They experience a decline that basically, well, yeah, and practically they completely close the fisheries because the populations of these species of economic interest, they completely collapsed. So there's a lot of interest in making sure that these species come back, that the kelp comes back, and that means a lot of kelp restoration efforts. Kelp restoration efforts has focused mostly on urchin removal. In this part of the coast, there's no predator for the urchins. So humans have started becoming this predator for the urchins. So we have a lot of divers going to the water, picking up the urchins by hand and taking them out of the water. Just like, for example, if they were red urchins, which are those that are of economic interest. Purple urchins are not that nutritious, especially these ones that are in the urchin barren. But this has been the main focus of the urchin removal. And in the short term, it seems to be working. If we look at this graph, I'm going to show several species, but here on 5 sites that were, well, on some sites that restoration has been working, the control is the parts where the purple urchins, they were not removed. And the restored parts is where the urchin were removed. As you can see, the purple urchin population in the restored sites went to extremely low values compared to the controls sites. On the short term, we're not seeing this recovery on the red urchins, which are those of economic interest. They are still on pretty low densities. So the fish, unfortunately, just doing this removal didn't bring the red urchins back on the short term. We still have to wait what happens on a mid to longer term. But what we have observed is that the kelp coverage has significantly increased. In the control sites, you see that there are some parts that kelp managed to come back, but in the restore ones, the kelp came back like between 3 and 5 times more. There's between 3 and 5 times more coverage than in the control sites. So kelp is coming back in the sites where there's less urchins. The problem with doing this is that extreme weather events can affect the restoration outcomes. So restoration is unfortunately not a guarantee. There is always a chance that the restorations may fail. So if we look at the blue part of this box as the successes of restoration and the black part of the box as the restoration failures, and these failures can happen because bad methodologies or simply bad luck. Like it could be that restoration starts in a year that there's a strong marine heat wave, and no matter how much recovery you do, the kelp is not coming back because it's a bad year for the water temperature. And this is exacerbated by the fact that extreme weather events, they may become more frequent as climate change intensity increases. And that leads to the black part of the box, the restoration failures, to become more and more prevalent. So restoration doesn't have to focus only on solving the problem now, but there needs to be an assessment of how to solve the problem or prevent the problem from happening in the future by making sure that the restoration successes are more likely than the failures. And if we look, for example, here, if we go and see the ore parts of the coast, here we have a map of the kelp coverage in the northern part of the state, the central part of the state, and the southern part of the state. We can see that the kelp in the northern coast hasn't recovered to its levels before the marine heat wave, which is this red box. And but in the central California coast and the southern California, kelp has made a stronger recovery. And one of the possible causes for this is that in the northern coast, the main predator is the sunflower seastar, but these populations have already collapsed. Whereas in the central coast, we have the sea otters, and the southern coast, there are some other predators of these purple urchins, such as the California sheephead fish and the spiny lobster. So this is hinting us that there is an important role that is being played by predators. So the research I'm going to present today is trying to answer the question of, will restoring orchid predators make the kelp forest more resistant to future marine heat waves? To do this, we developed a conceptual model. So in this conceptual model, we are looking at mostly the populations that are the main players in this game, which are the live kelp, the urchins, and some predator. Our focus is mostly on the northern coast, so we base most of the work on this project on using data coming from sunflower seastars. But I'm going to talk later in the presentation about what do these results mean for if we had sea otters in the northern coast. So live kelp, we're going to also model that it can produce drift kelp, and urchins can either consume drift kelp or live kelp. What we have seen in the field is that urchins actually prefer to eat drift kelp. It's basically it's a safer bet. It just falls into the ground, and they can just get out of their crevices, eat it, and get back to their crevices. Whereas when they have to actively graze live kelp, they have to go outside of their crevice for a while, look for a piece of live kelp and start munching it, and it takes more time for them, which makes it more risky also to be eaten by some predator, by a sunflower seastar, by a sea otter that's passing by. So we are also modeling that the grazing intensity of urchins is reduced when there's more drift kelp. We're also including the fact that urchins have a fear response, especially with sunflower seastars, not that much with sea otters. But basically in the presence of seastars, the urchins are more prone to hide in order to prevent being eaten by a seastar. That means that they are not that actively eating, looking for kelp. So that decreases the grazing intensity of urchins. And also as there is more kelp, the urchins will have more meat. They won't be starving, and that will affect the nutritional value of urchins. So we're also modeling that this has an impact on how many sea urchins are being eaten by a sea star or by a sea otter. So we have this conceptual model that looks at different processes that happen in the water. But what do we do with this model? So what we do is that we have several levers or dials that we call parameters. And these dials represent, for example, kelp growth rate, predator predation rate, many other parameters, the urchin grazing rate as well. These parameters, they are related to the processes that I was just describing. And we play with these dials, we move them around. And what we produce is that we produce different scenarios, such as in this figure, where if you look over time, the blue population is the only population that exists. But for some other parameter values, what we observe is that both the blue and the red population, they persist over time. So these are different scenarios that we can look by changing our parameters. And what scenarios are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the scenarios that we started this talk with, which are the kelp forest and the urchin barren. And we're coming back to this diagram where there's this little ball, right? And now I'm going to talk about how are we quantifying resistance. We can think of the system that we are looking at, whether it's in a kelp forest or an urchin barren. We can think of it as a ball. And this ball is trapped between these two cups, and the ball is trying to roll back to the lower part of these cups. And if you try to push the ball, if you don't push it too much, it's not going to go back. It's going to go back to the bottom of the cup. But if you push it too hard, it's going to go past this heel, and then it's going to start rolling down to the other cup. So how are we moving this ball? We're moving this ball with something like marine heat waves that are what we call disturbance effects. We're going to quantify this resistance in 3 ways. First, we have the recovery likelihood, which is basically the width of the cup. So the wider your cup is, the more that you have to move it before it can start climbing up to the hill. Then the recovery rate, which is how fast is the system recovering after disturbance. So if we move if we just give a little push on the ball, it's going to roll down back to the center. How fast does this rolling down happen? And then the resistance to disturbance is we can think of it as the height of this hill. So if it's a more resistant to disturbance system, then this hill is going to be higher. We're going to need more energy to push this ball up to the peak of the hill before a transition can occur. So what we do is that we play with these parameters that I was explaining in the previous slide, and we quantify these 3 metrics. Then we are going to, in the next slide, I'm going to present a type of analysis that we call global sensitivity analysis. And the results of a global sensitivity analysis look something like this. Here, I have all of the parameters in our model, and we are ranking that by importance. So what does importance mean? This analysis, what we are finding is that we are trying out thousands of combinations of the parameters, and then based on the results of these combinations, we are determining which parameters are most likely to affect the given metric. In this case, I'm presenting the results of the recovery likelihood. So the most important parameters are those that have the highest potential to change the value of this resistance metric. So what did we find with this global sensitivity analysis? Well, we found that live kelp to drift conversion, which is how much of the kelp is being torn apart and then falling down into the seabed and becoming the reef kelp. Kelp growth rate, how fast does kelp grow? Kelp to urchin conversion, which is the digestive process of the urchins, how much energy do they gain from eating kelp? And urchin preference of drift kelp, which is this fact that urchins go, if there's drift kelp available, they will prefer to eat that. We found that these 4 metrics, these 4 parameters are the most important in determining this recovery likelihood, which was the width of the cup. And there are some other parameters that we found that are less important. Similarly, for the recovery rate, we also find that drift kelp, which is this light green color, related parameters are super important. Things like the drift kelp escape rate, which is the drift kelp is being moved by waves or by currents, and it just goes far from where the urchins are. That's one of the most important factors. Kelp growth rate shows up again. How much drift kelp is being consumed per unit of time. And again, the live kelp to drift conversion rate, these are the most important factors in determining the recovery rate of the kelp forest. Mostly drift kelp pack parameters again. And all the other parameters of the model are there. Where we found that the predators are super important is in the resistance to disturbance, which is the height of this hill. And in here, we found that the top parameter is the predator predation rate, and none of the parameters are near it. They are is the main factor that produces a change in the resistance to disturbance. Some other factors like drift kelp, they are showing up, but as you can see, they are not as important as the predator predation rate. And some of our parameters like the kelp growth rate or how much drift kelp is being retained in the system, they actually our analysis found that they were not important at all in determining resistance to disturbance. So this is telling us that bringing back the seastars has the potential to produce a more resistant kelp forest, especially when we think about the resistance in terms of the marine heat waves. But, well, we are in the Sea Otter Awareness Week. We're not in the Seastar Awareness Week, unfortunately. What about sea otters? We know that sea otters are a huge predator of purple urchins, and they are not in the northern coast, but they are still a question of interest for people. And two things could happen when we think about including sea otters in this model instead of sea stars. For example, it could be that sea stars, we know that they can eat urchins, even though these urchins may not be that good. It's like if, for example, the sea stars will go to somewhere like a restaurant like Orchid King, and if you go to Yelp, it looks like Orchid King has a pretty low rating. But the sea stars are fine with it. Sea stars will go and they will eat at Orchid King no matter what. But if we have a sea otter instead, sea otters, they will go and see Orchid King. It has a one-star rating, and they won't like that. They will try to maybe, well, they don't drive, but they could go and swim a little further and find some better restaurant, like let's say Avalofilet. And they go, they open their phone, their kelp phone, and Avalofilet has 5 stars. Well, they will be pretty happy eating at Avalofilet. This is actually what a cartoon version of some of the observations that have been done in the Central Coast. Sea otters, they try to avoid the urchin barrens, and they don't eat urchins that don't have a high nutritional value. And this could be an issue for many stakeholders, where if we think about restoring sea otters into the northern coast, they may interfere with fisheries because sea otters may prefer to eat abalone or to eat red urchins over purple urchins, which are the ones that produce the urchin barrens. However, this is one scenario that we've observed in the Central Coast. But the flip side, we have also observed that sea otters, especially in the Aleutian Islands where this other study happened, these islands are in Alaska. The sea otters here have adapted to eating smaller urchins from the barrens. They just eat a little more, so they are still nutritious enough if they go and they eat more. And the truth is that we are not certain which of these two scenarios could happen in the northern coast. So there is some sort of uncertainty in the question of restoring sea otters. However, the key result of our study persists, especially if we think about how the central coast of California managed to recover pretty in a pretty healthy manner from the marine heat wave that happened in 2015, 2016. We come back to this slide, and the places where there's a predator of the purple urchins, they managed to recover more or less decently in the from this marine heat wave. Whereas if you see the northern coast, recovery is still slow. And that is suggesting that predators are playing an important role here. So in conclusion, predator reintroduction has the potential to increase the resistance of the kelp forest to future marine heat waves. Our results are mostly based on sunflower seastars, which are the main predator in the northern coast. However, sea otters may also be capable of adapting to lower quality of prey, which means that they may also have the potential to make this kelp forest more resistant. And these results suggest that a mid to long-term recovery of a predator could be key to ensure the resistance of the kelp forest to increasing intensities of climate change. So thank you for listening. I would like to thank the rest of my team, the modeling team and the experimental team that have made this work possible. And this project was funded by NSF and the California Sea Grant. Thank you.
Okay, I seem to be unable to start my video.
Oh, let me stop my video then.
No, I think somebody
Oh.
needs to do that on the back
Oh.
end. Are we able to start my video? I don't have control over it.
Oh, your video, sorry.
Well, that's okay. I don't need a video. Nobody needs to see me. Thank you so much, Jorge. That was fantastic. And I'm really excited to, here we go. Sorry, now I've got video. I'm really excited to jump into some conversation about your research. I think it's really interesting. So I want to remind everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A and not the chat, because that's what we'll be monitoring here for questions. And again, if you are catching this live streaming on Facebook or on YouTube, please go ahead and comment your questions. We do have somebody who's going to try to pull those questions over to us here so that Jorge can respond to them. So let's see. I wanted to start. We have a comment in the Q&A box from Ken Rasmussen that she really appreciated the diagram and analogy used for quantifying resistance between these alternate stable states of the sea urchin barren and the kelp forests. So thank you, Kim, for that. Yeah. And I'll get started while we're waiting for other questions to populate. I was really interested, Jorge, early on you talked about the impact of not only predation on sea urchins, but also their fear response to just having predators in their environment. And I was really interested about that and about, you know, the relative impact of the actual predation on the sea urchins versus their fear response and maybe avoiding feeding just because they're scared of being fed upon themselves. But in your model, I looked very quickly and carefully at your slide, and I saw that fear response was pretty low down. It was not a significant sort of part of overcoming the resistance to these two alternate stable states. So is that true, that basically that the fear response doesn't have as much of an impact relative to actual predation on these sea urchins?
Thank you, Sarah. That's actually a great question. And I'm going to be honest with you. This was one of the most surprising results that we had when we were doing this analysis, because we thought that the fear response will just basically get the predation all the way back to zero, or well, almost no grazing, right? And but what we found is that if you go through all of the global sensitivity analysis, the fear response is pretty down in the for recovery rate is like halfway. For resistance to disturbance is are also halfway. It's not as important as the drift preference and the predation rate. And this is not this is something that comes to me from understanding the mechanisms behind the model, is that my hypothesis is that fear response plays a higher role in the organism to organism interaction. But when we look at an ecosystem-wide effect, having less urchins has a bigger impact than having less urchins actively grazing.
Right.
So that's my intuition thinking about the mechanisms behind the model. But
Cool.
yeah, this was a totally surprising result for us too.
Yeah, very surprising. Okay, cool. Well, we've got a number of questions here populating. Actually, they're coming in faster than I can even count them up. So I am going to get to some of our audience questions now. We've got one from Robert Spies, and please excuse me if I mispronounce anyone's name. Is there a possibility of carrying out field experiments to test the model assumptions before widespread introduction of sea otters?
So I'm reading the question. I'm assuming that this is based on the second part as well. If the seastars can be cultivated in captivity.
Yes, thank you.
So seastars are actually being cultivated in captivity by one of my collaborators in Friday Harbor Labs, Jason Holding, and this could be an interesting idea to explore in the field. There are a couple of concerns about this part though. First, the sea stars, they take several years to reach the size that people think of when they think of sunflower sea stars. These sunflower sea stars can be up to 1 meter in diameter. They are huge, but they take several years to be that big. And second, we are still not sure, because of this wasting sea star disease, if putting more sea stars in the water, they will just die out of the disease, or if they will infect the other little populations that we still have left. So there's a lot of, we're not at that part yet where we can do these field experiments, but it's something that people are thinking about. It's just a big challenge to try to do this at this point.
Right. Okay, so let's, oh gosh, this is populating so quickly. I can't keep up with where I am in the questions. After seeing, sorry, this question comes from, oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping one. This comes from Brian Storms. Could you speak more about extreme weather or climate events that can affect kelp populations?
Sure. So the biggest one is what we call marine heat waves. They are basically like the heat waves that we have here in California, but in the water. So kelp, it grows best in a temperature range between about 12 and 18 degrees Celsius. But during some years, the water in the coast has been able to reach temperatures of up to like even above 20 degrees Celsius, which so it's probably pretty comfortable for people, but it's a terrible environment for kelp growth. And this is a challenge, especially when we have events like El Nino, where the water temperatures increase significantly. Actually, the blob was an extreme El Nino effect. So yes, temperature of the water is the main extreme weather event that we are worried about when we talk about kelp.
Okay. Next question from Ruth Statnick. After seeing the presentation yesterday on genetics of sea otters, should we consider getting Aleutian sea otters into Northern California instead of those from Central California?
That's a good question. I originally thought this could be an option. What I've learned from other experts that work more closely with the sea otter reintroduction questions is that the one of the biggest cause of mortality for sea otters when we try to reintroduce them is that they are eaten by sharks. So northern coast in the northern coast of California, there are a lot of high density of shark populations. So that means that probably the question is not which type of sea otters to introduce, but what like how to minimize the shark bite rates of sea otters in this part of the coast.
Yeah, and I'm happy to jump in to answer some of that question too, because I think it really related to Dr. Beichman's work that we heard from last night as well. I think is what Ruth might be asking is specifically to the fact that she had mentioned that since there is going to be a bottleneck that's occurred in the southern sea otter population, and obviously in genetics, if you can get sort of new blood in there, that's better for the population as a whole. However, there are some distinct differences between the otters that are going to be further up north in the northern population versus the southern population. So even though maybe genetically it could be beneficial genetically, she also mentioned how historically in looking at some of the ancestral and his DNA that they do have is showing that in California, most of those sea otters would have been of the southern stock. And so it is potentially not the best idea to bring them from all the way up to Aleutians down, but that might be more of a question for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm not going to answer that fully, but I will say that that is a very good question to talk about the genetics and how to get that through. But I think there's a lot more complication in the fact of that being distinctly different at this point. And through that range that has been missing, those missing links have really been that idea that there was sort of a gradation occurring in that genetics over time. But that was a really good question.
Thanks, Heather. Let's see, our next question, I see that one of your co-authors, Jorge, Marisa Bascat, has jumped in and given some URLs, but let me ask you as well. This question comes from Nori Yatsunami. Can you talk about the manual purple urchin removal effort by divers? And are there organized volunteer opportunities to participate in? Just in case you have anything to add, or if you've investigated those manual removals at all in this research.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would like to thank Marisa first for answering the part of the volunteer opportunities. That's something I'm totally disconnected of regarding the opportunities side. But the manual removal, it's basically divers come, they go down to the urchin barren and they start collecting purple urchins, and they take them out of the water. And I guess different organizations do different things with the purple urchins. That's something that's beyond my expertise, but it's basically divers go down, take as many sea urchins as possible, and then they remove them from the water.
All right, let's see. From Ken Sussman, local resistance to reintroduction of sea otters to the kelp restoration scenarios. Oh, sorry. Wait a minute. Oh, sorry. This is.
No, it moved on you.
It moved. Okay. Here we go. I'll try this again. The local resistance to reintroduction of sea otters to the Mendocino coast seems to be centered on sea otter predation of important economic species, such as fish and abalone. Our abalone population has plummeted because of a lack of kelp. Abalone seem to be able to hide in crevices and to feed primarily on drift kelp. This behavior seems to make abalone more successful at avoiding being eaten by otters. Is this true? I don't know if this is something that
I'm happy to take this one, Jorge.
I think this is more on Heather's realm. Yeah, thank you.
That is an absolutely excellent question. And I've had a lot of conversation regarding this topic with different community members and stakeholders. And so that is true. So I think Jorge sort of touched on the fact of when you have predators, there ends up sort of being a fear of those predators, right? And so in his talk, he explained that with at least the sunflower sea star and the sea otters with urchins, there seemed to be more fear of the sunflower sea star, which honestly, from knowing how sea otters dive down, it makes sense, right? If you're going to have a predator that's literally chasing you at your same level consistently, because it's not going up and down, makes perfect sense. A sea otter is going to have to go back up for air, going to have to drive down. They'll pocket a whole bunch of urchins at that time, and then they'll go back up and then they'll eat them up there. So you're going to have a slightly different behavior in that predation. So I think that that's a really important caveat to sort of add to that, is just the behavior of these different predators can add to that different type of fear. So that's interesting to hear that I never heard that before, but I think that's fascinating to think about, that urchins might have slightly different, they're not aware of the otters coming down as opposed to that sunflower sea star that's been right there next to them that whole time. Something currently happened, we understand that it can happen with abalone as well. There has been research on black abalone out of UC Santa Cruz. There's been papers on that out of San Nicolas research. And what was found there was that as you had sea otters returning into that area, there was a translocation of San Nicolas and started repopulating, as well as black abalone. When sea otters started to come down and prey upon them, there ended up being more of a prey response. So they would go deeper into the crevices, and that's harder for sea otters to get to. In some cases, they probably will not be able to get to them. I mean, they are very dexterous, and if they could, they would most likely try. But that can also cause more dives. Sea otters they want to eat the most nutritious thing. They're constantly burning through fuel. So they want to go for something that they know they can get and is successful. So certainly if there's a big enough abalone, it takes them 10 dives to get to, they will do that. But if it's too hard, they're not going to necessarily waste their time, because that's a lot of waste of energy. So that is something that has been seen, is that as those abalone go deeper into those crevices, they're allowed to grow larger. They become more reproductive, especially if they're able to eat drift kelp, right? And so I know I've been hearing that there's sort of a little bit of a misconception of these zombie urchins, because some of them that do get that drift kelp coming through, they're able to actually eat some of that. And so that's been super, super helpful. But as urchins start to get more of their gonads and more of what sea otters want to eat, they're obviously going to go for those. So I think that kind of leads into the question too, I've been getting a lot, is, do we say that sea otters will help kelp forest because they eat urchins, but they don't eat zombie urchins? And so I think that there's a bit of I think Dr. Josh Smith's work really looking at that, which had to do with the outer level, is as sea otters dive down, they're going to be going for the urchins that are actively eating on that kelp forest, removing them. And then it's almost like a wound that starts to heal. So you're not healing from the center where all the slow non-moving ones are, but rather from those at the edges that are actively foraging. But that is a great question to think about abalone. And there's a lot more to be learned, a lot more research to be done.
Awesome. Okay, our next question is from Andrew Johnson. Jorge, are you continuing to work on modeling for these kelp restoration scenarios, or have you moved on to other projects at Carnegie? Are you able to model the synergistic effects of the different restoration activities, urchin removal, kelp outplanting, seastar culturing, reintroduction, sea otter reintroduction, and others, or and should we pursue collaborative rewilding projects that combine restoration efforts?
Thank you. Yes, so that's just wanted to clarify that this was part of the research I did during my PhD. So yes, unfortunately, right now I'm not doing as much working on the kelp forest management and restoration side. I'm still working on collaborating on some projects mostly on the seastar part, on understanding the dynamics of the seastar wasting disease. That's one of the current lines of research that I'm actually pursuing. And regarding the part of the synergistic restoration strategies, I'm going to quickly share the last slide. You can actually go access my website. You can see my list of publications there, and we got in March of this year a paper published on this part where we were looking at the short-term strategies, the things that management are either doing right now or they are capable of doing in the short term. How a combination of these restoration strategies is capable of enhancing the recovery of the kelp forest in the short term. The predator side, just because that's more of a mid to long term, that's something that we didn't explore in that research, but it's something that people in my lab, in Marisa's lab, are looking at. And thank you, Marisa, for including the paper into the Q&A section. I think the paper is open access, so you won't have trouble to access it. But if not, just send me an email and I'll be happy to share it.
Yeah, very cool. Let's see here. We're almost out of time, but let's see if we have just a couple of last questions here. Oh yeah, and if you're interested in those links to the papers, Marissa added those in the Q&A box in response to the questions, so you can check out the links there. From Ruth Statnick again, the Alaskan area sea otters may also be more comfortable in the cold waters of the North Coast. Heather, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very good, thing to think about as we're going into more climate change. I'm not a specialist in that particular aspect of their physiological ecology. I would say that for the northern, when you think about going up to the poles, you get larger animals, right? So the northern stock is significantly generally larger than our southern stock. So males can get up to 100 pounds versus here it's, closer to the 70, 80 pounds. So I would say that might actually pose some interesting. I'm not going to say that would be something they consider because that's not my specialty. But I would say that given the fact that they do have some physiological differences to survive in those more extreme difference of temperatures, may cause an issue with that.
Okay, and I think this last one is probably also for you, Heather. When in Iceland, this is also from Ruth. When in Iceland, we visited the family of the chancellor of the university in Akureyri. I am sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And his family, and it's bouncing around. Let's see. And his family captures and buries sharks to produce something called 1,000-year-old shark. That's a delicacy in Japan. Maybe this could replace some of the fishery that locals are afraid of losing if we bring sea otters back to the North Coast. It would reduce the possible shark predation on sea otters and offer an alternative crop. I'm sure the folks from Iceland would be willing to help local fishers learn how to do this more safely.
Well, so that's definitely an interesting sort of caveat of sort of discussing the issue that there is potential predation of sea otters by white sharks. I will say that white sharks are a protected species, so they are also in recovery. And so there is no fishing of white sharks, but, and I honestly don't think that actually removing white sharks is necessarily going to solve the issue we're seeing. I think what we have to kind of take a moment and step back is realize that what we are witnessing is a restoring of balance between multiple different populations. This isn't just about sea otters, this isn't just about sharks, this isn't just about urchins. We sort of talk about rewilding and sort of bringing back, restoring balance to an entire ecosystem that's along our coastlines. Sea otters, white sharks, urchins, abalone, even humans, we have been here for thousands and thousands of years. And so they lived in coexistence for thousands and thousands of years. It's actually quite recent that we've had this mass depletion of everything, right? We had colonizers had to come in and kill all the sea otters, and then we had to kill all the sharks, and so then you had this everything out of balance, and now we're trying to figure out these puzzle pieces and these missing links of is there a possibility to restore some of that balance, which I think Jorge kind of talks about beautifully of some of these different modeling that occurred to kind of give us ideas of what potential can happen, especially with resistance as more climate change and warming waters come through. So I think that ultimately we are starting to learn more about these predator-prey relationships, not to say that they're bad, and rather to say that perhaps if potential reintroduction does occur, certain locations would be thought of being more beneficial than others because perhaps there's a fishery there, or perhaps that this is a area like an estuary that's more secure and safe for a reintroduction or a population to really rebound before going out into open waters, potentially to help the fact that maybe then kelp would be able to restore as sea otters are in an estuary, but feeding offshore. And then with more kelp, there'd be more protection from white sharks. So there's a lot of layers here. But I don't think necessarily starting a fishery for sharks would be necessarily helpful for that. But thank you for that question.
Thanks so much, Heather. We have hit the end of our webinar time slot for today. I want to thank you, Heather Barrett and Sea Otter Savvy, for sponsoring Sea Otter Awareness Week. Thank you so much, Jorge, for presenting your research to us. It was really incredible and really interesting to hear about. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. We enjoyed having you. I'm sorry if we didn't get to any questions that you had for us. Please feel free to reach out to us and we will, share your question to the right person. And happy Sea Otter Awareness Week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.